Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Rona told me that I could start, so I'm just going to jump right in. I'll introduce myself. My name is Brian Earp. I'm a very new associate professor of philosophy, psychology, and biomedical ethics at the National University of Singapore. Before that, I was living in England for a number of years, and I was sort of beginning to adopt a British identity. But I also was born in the United States, in Seattle. So I'm very interested in the interplay between local and global. Another name that comes to mind is Kwame Anthony Apaya's work on cosmopolitanism, where he says it's not so much that you want to be a citizen of the world that's unmoored from your own local history, but your local history informs the way that you're a citizen of the world, and your worldliness can also feed back into your local context. So wonderful ideas that you were just sharing. I'm going to be talking about something very, very different. So we're going to change topics completely. I'm specifically going to talk about two ideas that are usually discussed separately. So the first idea has to do with the ethics of life extension on the one hand. And by this I mean the use of medical and scientific technologies to try to radically extend the average human life beyond potentially even currently natural limits. There's also a more modest form of life extension which just seeks to extend our lives by some substantial amount so that the average in different countries, for example, raises up significantly. So that's the first idea, and we'll come back to that in a second. The second idea has to do with artificial intelligence, which many people are thinking about now. And the reason why many people are thinking about it is because of the recent release of these large language models from OpenAI was the first and most prominent one. So how many people here have played around with ChatGPT or a similar kind of large language model, just in your own experience? You just raise your hand if you've had any experience with a large language model. Okay, you seem almost shy to put up your hands. It's okay, I play around with these models too. So what I'll want to say about this is that these models, you can get them generally from the companies and use them to produce work, if you like. But it's also possible now, and pretty easy, to do what is called fine-tuning on the models. So you can train the models on more specific information, and that can be a specific area of research, for example. But you can also train a model on facts about and writing produced by a particular individual, a particular person. And you can give a model data about a particular person so that the model almost comes to be a digital replica of that person. It can encode their beliefs, their preferences, their values, their writing style. These can also be done in a multimodal way where you can sample their speech patterns. You can create a deep fake of a person where you have a visual representation of them that's melded to this linguistic representation of them. And so in effect, you're able to create a digital twin of a person. And actually, before I gave this talk this morning, as I was coming here, I was thinking that twin is not the right word. So I'm going to use a different word, and let me explain why I think twin is not the right word. So when you have a human twin, a biological sibling, they share certain biological features with you, certain genetic features with you, but their mental life is different. They have a different seat of consciousness. They have a different mental history. They see the world differently from the very moment of birth. What I'm talking about in digital twins, which I'll now call digital duplicates or digital replicas, is almost the exact opposite of that, or the inverse of that. So a digital replica shares your mental life to some extent, but doesn't share any biological features with you, right? So you see how it's the opposite of a biological twin. And so I'm now thinking to myself, I shouldn't use the language of twin because it's misleading. This is really a digital duplicate of your mental life or certain features of your mental life, certain features of your psychology. So this is the second idea that I'll come back to. And I'll try to see if there's a way of relating these two ideas and whether some interesting philosophical insights might emerge. Okay. So let's come back to the notion of life extension. I looked up some statistics on the plane on the way here, and the statistic I was interested in was the average lifespan for men and women in Indonesia. And it turns out it's a little bit different for men and women, and this is quite common in many countries. Women tend to live longer than men, as it happens. So I just want you to guess, or perhaps you know, what do you think is the average human lifespan for women in Indonesia? If you take the average of all these diverse cultures and islands and so forth, and you sum it together and create this statistical object of the average for women, does anyone know about what that is? You can make a guess. Who's brave enough to try? Yes, okay. What's your guess? Yeah, it's about 70, give or take, you know, a few decimal points. Okay, and does anyone have a guess for the average lifespan for men, for males in Indonesia? You already know it's going to be less than 70, so that's a tip for you. Any guess? Do you have a guess? I saw your eyebrows raise in anticipation, like you maybe have a guess. 65, yeah, it's 66, about 65, yeah. So maybe the first puzzle for life extension is to see how to extend the life of men to get a little higher, maybe a little more towards equality with women. Now, here's the first point about why philosophy matters for questions of life extension, among many other questions in society. Life extension is partly a scientific or a technical problem. And that's a very complicated problem. So let's set aside the limitations of technology and just focus on the moral question. Let's say that you could extend your own life by some amount by taking this pill tomorrow. So for men, you have an average expectancy of 65, for women about 70. Let's say that we could get men and women up to 85. How many people would want to take this pill to allow you to live until you were 85 instead of 65 or 70? Interesting, okay. So the Americans in the room are interested in extending our lives through magic pills. So I'm curious, it seems like almost everyone is either reluctant to share that they want to take a magic pill, or you don't want to take this magic pill. You're happy to have a lifespan of about 65 or 70 and sort of pass away at that time. So does somebody want to share why you feel this reluctance, why you don't like the idea of this pill? I'm genuinely very curious. There's no right or wrong answers. You can just share whatever your view is. Yeah, Tariq.
Our life is getting worse.
Say that?
Our world is getting worse.
The world is getting worse. Right, that's good. So one aspect of thinking about ethical questions is always to put them in the context of the wider social, cultural, political, geographical, existential type questions. Do you think that this is a trajectory that is very likely to continue, or do you think that there's a possibility of reversal? Maybe society gets so confronted by the deterioration that's happening in some respects that we turn around and we aim for a more optimistic future. Do you think that's possible, or are you more of a pessimist? I hear some pessimism. Okay. It's very interesting. There is something about the American culture that's stereotypically more optimistic, that's always striving to see how things can be made better. So maybe that's why Andrew and I are thinking we might like to take this pill. You know, by many metrics, the world is getting better. So in terms of infant mortality rates, life expectancy is growing in many countries, often due to better health care and resources. There are some aspects in which we're confronted by the worst of the world because of the way that media works. And media tends to focus on things that are likely to grab our attention. And the things that grab our attention are things that are depressing or shocking or outraging. And so when you scroll on social media or you watch the news, you tend to have your mind taken over by the things that are not working very well. But we should, speaking of epistemology, what do we know and how do we know? Our informational context is pre-selected for us. We don't have a direct access to all the world's knowledge that's unfiltered by the interests of media companies or governments, for example. So there are some debates about this, but by many objective measures, the world is getting increasingly better in terms of core categories that we might care about, like the ability of infants to survive into childhood and go on to adulthood, the ability of people to have enough food to eat, and have a place for shelter. There are many exceptions to this, and we tend to focus on the exceptions, but the overall trajectory is one of significant increase over time. So does that change your answer at all? Once you learned that on many measures the world's objectively getting better, does that make you want to maybe live longer, Tariq? Okay, all right. So this is a fact-sensitive opinion that you have. It's premised on certain understandings of the world. If those understandings change, you're willing to change your preference. Okay. So many governments are investing in research programs to try to extend the human lifespan. And one thing that they have to consider is how much to prioritize those investments compared to other ways they could be spending that money. So one of the ethical questions that I'll be focusing on is the question of trade-offs and alternatives. Whenever we're thinking about how much we should invest in one type of project, we have to consider not just in the abstract, how much would we like to pursue that aim, but we have to think about what are the trade-offs, what are the alternatives. What are we not investing in if we invest in life extension, for example? And one debate that people have about this is whether we should be focusing on trying to extend the lifespan of future generations, because it's not going to happen immediately. Probably in our lifetimes, we're not going to have significant lifespan extension. It might be for the next generation or the next generation. In other words, we're pursuing a technology that if it stands to benefit anyone, it's going to benefit people who don't exist currently, people who will exist in the future. So one philosophical question is, how much of our resources that we have today should we spend on trying to improve the quality of life of currently existing people versus how much should we invest in trying to make the world more hospitable to future generations, to our children or our children's children or our children's children's children. And what's interesting about them is that they don't exist. So it's a real question about how we should shape our priorities. You might think that somehow actually existing people should be given more moral consideration than future potential people or possible people. On the other hand, that kind of temporally constricted thinking can also seem very irresponsible. You know, we could burn through all of our resources and fail to address serious problems like climate change and leave the world much worse for our children and our children's children. And many people feel that we have responsibilities to those who come after us, even though they don't exist. So that's a philosophical question about the nature of the duty that we may have to people who don't yet exist. So that's one trade-off I want us to consider, is the use of resources to try to help future generations versus the use of resources to try to improve the quality of life of people who exist today. But here's another aspect of the puzzle that I think philosophy can help to illuminate, and that is the why question. Why might anyone want to live longer? Now that they've been equipped with this knowledge that the world's getting better, so maybe more of you will want to live longer, what do you think is the reason for that? What would be the motivation? Just think from an individual perspective. So let's set aside governments making social policies. Let's think of an individual human life. Let's say that you are 64, Tariq, and so you know you're coming up on the average end of a lifespan for men in Indonesia. And now I offer you this magic pill, and I say, I can get you, 10 more years. And let's say that you're in reasonably good health, you have a good quality of life, but, it might be that you have a heart condition or something that causes you to die suddenly. But I can say, I'll give you this pill, and it will ensure that that doesn't happen for 10 years, unless some other accident occurs. So what would be some reasons that you or anyone who might be in this position, why might you want to take the pill? Or imagine you're an American, and you're just very optimistic about the future. Just put yourself in their shoes. What do you think would be a reason for wanting to extend your life? Why would you want to live longer? And again, it's just a brainstorming session. You're doing this philosophy with me. I don't have a correct answer I'm going to try to quiz you on. Yes? Huh? Family? So, your family might miss you. Many of you, I'm sure, have lost relatives, and sometimes that's very sad. Now, sometimes we feel, especially if somebody's been suffering, or they've lived a very full life and it feels like there's diminishing returns or something like that, we might think, you know, it's their time. It's okay for them to go, and we should learn how to grieve. But, you know, our practices around grief are partly contingent on the fact that we typically die at a certain age. But if we didn't typically die at a certain age, maybe we would think there was something unfortunate about passing away at the ripe young age of 65. So our family might miss us. We might have obligations to our family that it's harder for us to fulfill if we don't exist anymore, or if we exist in some other metaphysical plane. So family is a good one, and I'm going to come back to that example. And you had an idea. Say that again? Unlimited desires. Okay. So later, I think we're going to have a podcast interview about theories of well-being. And so I've been thinking about different theories of well-being. And one major theory is a theory of desire satisfaction. So you can have a very simple theory of well-being, which just balances pleasures and pains. You know, if you have generally more positive experiences in life than negative experiences, maybe that's one view of what well-being consists in. But on some more sophisticated views, well-being also, or instead, consists in having desires fulfilled, things that you really want and care about. Now, some of our desires are maybe very trivial. I have a desire for ice cream. I typically always have a desire for ice cream. But, you know, if there was no ice cream, I think I would still have lots of well-being, because there are deeper desires that I have, including desires to care for my family. That's an example of a desire. I have a desire to try to contribute positively to the world. So another dimension that I want to raise here is that sometimes people want to leave a legacy in some sense. They want to finish a project that they hope will have value for others, for the community, or for their family, maybe even for how they are remembered. Perhaps they have a more self-centered reason for wanting to leave something to the world. Probably some people have that motive. But I think many people may feel they're on the cusp of contributing something really important. Let's say that you're a cancer researcher, and you feel that you're just on the cusp of coming to an important discovery that could lead to a treatment that could save many lives. You might feel it's very unfortunate if you can't complete this project because your life is cut short relative to what is possible with this, so far, magic pill that we're discussing. So some ideas that we have here are, we might have relational concerns toward our family. We might have legacy concerns. And since we're talking about well-being and preference satisfaction, on many views of what well-being consists in, there's a prerequisite for well-being, which is the having of conscious experiences of a certain type. So on some views, in order to be a candidate for well-being, you have to be able to feel, subjectively, at least pleasures and pains. So I'm going to propose a third potential reason people might want to extend their lives, which is simply the continued existence of their own consciousness. They might want to have more experiences. So one example I'll get us to think about is, you know, Halley's Comet returns once in many, many years. I don't know the exact number. And it's this very spectacular event. And maybe getting to experience that subjectively, getting to gaze up on the sky and experience this celestial event, which only happens, you know, once every many generations. If you know that that's going to happen in the next few years and you're on your deathbed, you might think it's unfortunate that you won't be around long enough to experience this amazing celestial event, just as one example. So why is philosophy important here? If you have governments that are just investing resources in trying to extend our lives without really interrogating deeply why that might be a good thing to do, or possibly a bad thing, maybe we shouldn't invest our resources that way. But let's focus on possible advantages or benefits of this just for now. When we take a philosophical approach to this question, we start to consider whether there are underlying reasons that are maybe the true goals that we're trying to fulfill. So what I want to propose is, we probably are not interested in just merely extending our biological lives. I don't think that's the ultimate goal. Here's an example. Suppose you're in a coma, a permanent state of unconsciousness. And medical technologies that are very sophisticated can be used to keep you alive, biologically, for years and years and years in this permanent unconscious state. It's possible that somebody with very unusual preferences might have a preference to stay merely alive, but I think most people would feel, if I'm never going to regain consciousness, if I'm never going to participate in relationships with my family again, if I'm never going to complete the important life project that I've been working on and leave a legacy to the world, it's not clear that just extending my life is the goal. So one thing that I think philosophy teaches us about this case is people are probably more interested in extending their selves rather than their biological life. So what's a self? That's a big topic in philosophy. Descartes had some ideas about this. There may be different dimensions or aspects to ourselves. Sometimes in this talk I'll be speaking about our psychological life or psychological features that we have. And there are many science fiction type thought experiments where people have imagined over the years that we could separate our psychological life from our biological embodiment. Now, it's an open question whether that's possible. There are some views of consciousness according to which consciousness can only really emerge from platforms that are very like brains embodied in biological selves like we have today. But some people think that consciousness could possibly be scaffolded on top of some other type of platform, maybe a digital platform. Maybe you could upload the functional features of your brain or your mind onto a computer chip and exist in that form with subjective experiences. But these are very controversial views. So I'm going to come back to the idea of trade-offs and alternatives. What happens when we have to think about a second best option for pursuing a certain goal? And then how does that affect our decisions about how to allocate our resources? So now I'm going to get over to this idea about artificial intelligence and fine-tuning a model to create a digital duplicate of yourself. And hopefully in about 5 minutes you'll see why these are connected. But first I'm going to take a sip of water. 1 second. Okay, so together we came up with this idea that there are at least 3 things that people might really care about when they're talking about life extension. And with my colleagues, we've proposed in a paper recently that what people are really interested in is something like person span extension. Not lifespan extension, but person span extension. And it happens to be the case that you can only extend yourself as a person in a traditional sense if you extend your biological life, but that might not always be true. Also, you can ask a further question, which is, why do people want to extend their person span? And we came up with some examples. It might be that they want to continue to relate to their families, to meet certain familial obligations, or obligations to their friends or others in their community. So there might be relational reasons why people want to extend their person span, as we call it. There might be reasons that have to do with leaving a legacy. So we talk about having an impact on the world, hopefully a positive one. And then there's this third one I discussed, which is wanting to continue to have subjective experiences, to consciously take in the world, maybe because you want to view a beautiful celestial event that only comes around once every many generations. So by thinking about what we really want underneath lifespan extension or person span extension, we can start to see whether there might be other ways of at least partially meeting those goals that don't involve extending our biological lives. We can think about whether there are alternative policies we might pursue or alternative technologies we might invest in to help us with what the actual goals are, rather than a proxy for those goals. And so now I want to suggest that it's possible that a digital duplicate could help us meet maybe 2 out of the 3 goals that we're talking about. And just to get to the punchline and then build back up to this, most philosophers of technology are confident that large language models do not and cannot have subjective consciousness. So although they can mimic human linguistic behavior very successfully, I'd say the predominant view is that large language models don't have the infrastructure to support subjective consciousness. There's nothing it's like to be, to use Nagel's phrase, a large language model. So if what you want to do is to continue your subjective experience of the world, a large language model duplicate of you, I'm just going to assume, cannot help you with that, because it can't serve as a platform to host your consciousness going forward. That's debated. There are some philosophers who are radically proposing that at least future versions of large language models may very well acquire a subjective, phenomenal consciousness. There might be something it's like to be them. They might even one day be able to experience pleasures and pains, perhaps if they're integrated in with biological substrates. But for now, we're just going to assume that one of our three goals can't be met with a large language model. But I want to see whether it might help us with the other two goals, leaving a legacy and engaging in or caring for certain types of relationships after our biological life stops. So to tell you about this, I'll give you a personal story. This is a real thing that happened to me, which is that after ChatGPT was released, there were about 2 weeks where I was reading all these news articles of people suggesting that this amazing technology had come out. And I tend to be a little bit skeptical of these kinds of news articles. I'm familiar with the way that hype can often cause us to feel more excited about something than is really justified. But after enough reading of these articles, I thought, okay, I'll try to see what this new technology is all about. So I got access to ChatGPT, and I played around with it for a while, and I thought, oh, this is a significant advance over previous forms of artificially intelligent communicative entities, or chatbots, as I'll say. And I had a housemate named Sebastian Porsdam-Mann, who also happens to be a philosopher who's interested in technology. And he had the idea that we should maybe try to train one of these chatbots on all of my previous publications. Now, I'm very fortunate to have been able to be a writer and a philosopher for over a decade now, and I've accumulated quite a lot of publications. Writing that, because I work in ethics, explicitly encodes my values, my argumentation, my beliefs, certain deep preferences that I have for how the world should go. And so it turned out not to be very technically complicated. We were able to do this with the help of a research assistant. It took about a week. And the way we trained this model is we took the title and the abstract of a published paper, and we put that in as the prompt, and then we trained it to complete on the rest of the paper. So the model starts to learn the relationship between a short description of an idea and how I actually executed that idea on more than 100 examples of various papers. And we got to the point where we could then test our new model and see if it could generate new material in my voice, in my writing style, using reasons that I employ, reflecting values that I have argued for. And so the way we did this is we put in the title and the abstract of a paper that I have always wanted to write, but I just haven't got around to. I don't have enough time. In fact, I have many papers like this, ideas for papers that I just don't have the time to actually write. So we put in the title and the abstract, and then we just pressed go and asked the model to write a paper. And it had varying success. Sometimes it kind of came up with gobbledygook, and other times it came up with a pretty good example of a paper that might have taken me a month to write, and it would write it in, 1 minute or less. So this was very startling to us, because it wasn't just using ChatGPT to write a paper that sounds very generic, like the average of everything that's ever been published on the internet, which is basically what ChatGPT is trained on, is all human writing that it's been able to get access to for training. Here, because it was fine-tuned on my papers, the last few layers of the neural network were trained on my papers, the writing that was produced sounded a lot like me. But of course, this is basically a chatbot that has this capacity. So I can also talk to the chatbot, and I can ask it questions and engage with it. I can say, for example, what do you think I would want if X, Y, and Z happened? And see what it says. And it turns out it's learned my preferences and my values, so it can answer successfully. So just as one quick detour, I'm going to tell you about a possible use of one of these fine-tuned models in medicine, and then I'm going to come back to this idea of life extension. So after we trained this model, we were very ethically confused, and we thought, should we even be allowed to use this model? I mean, I can write a draft of a paper in 30 seconds that's pretty good. I'd have to edit it and fix it a little bit, but basically I could produce a publishable paper in a very short period of time based on just the abstract, which only took me so long to write. So what we did is we manually wrote a paper on the ethics of using fine-tuned language models to produce papers. So we didn't use the language model to do it. That would have been very meta. We just wrote it by ourselves. And so that was one paper. And we call this an automated, unique content generator or something like that, and it stands for AutoGen. So AutoGen is the name of our fine-tuned model, and we wrote a paper about the ethics of AutoGen. But as we were doing this, I had this other idea of a use to which this fine-tuned model, this personalized AI, could be put. And this has to do with a very common and very tragic healthcare situation. So the healthcare situation is this. Someone gets in a terrible accident, and they come into the emergency room, and they've suffered brain damage, and they are unconscious. And it's unclear whether they will regain consciousness, and it's unclear whether the investment of a lot of medical resources will ever allow them to have a good quality of life, even if their consciousness is regained. Sometimes in a situation like this, there's a clear medical answer to what should be done. Either it's obvious that you can treat the person and help them restore consciousness and have a good quality of life, and then as a doctor, you're ethically required to do that, unless they have a do not resuscitate order or something like that. Other times, it's clear that the situation is futile. There's really nothing you can do as a doctor to help this person. And in that case, it's unethical to continue to treat them because you're wasting resources to no good end. But other times, it's unclear what you should do. And often, it may have to do in part with a value judgment about how to balance these trade-offs. Investing resources, maybe you'll get quality of life. It's unclear what the person would want. And in the United States, which is a very individualistic culture, there's a clear ethical standard which is called the substituted judgment standard. And the family will be called in to help make this decision, but the family's job is to try to help the doctors understand what would that person want. So you're supposed to make a substituted judgment to respect their former autonomy. And the family comes in and they consult on this and they say, well, based on some conversations we had in the past, I assume that Brian would want every effort to be made to save his life. Or I know based on some of Brian's values that he feels he's lived a good life and he wouldn't want to waste medical resources, so he'd want to be allowed to pass away. But many families haven't had this conversation with the person, and so it really is unclear what they would want, and the problem is you can't ask them because they're not available. So this is a real challenge. Now, I recently moved to Singapore, and I've learned that in Singapore and China, and it may be the case in Indonesia as well, there are different medical ethical standards. Often it has to do with a familial judgment about what would be best for the family unit and for harmony within the family as a whole. But what I've also learned is that it's easy to stereotype Western versus Eastern ways of thinking about this situation. You know, Easterners are all interested in communality and groups, and Westerners are interested in individuality and selfishness. But of course, I also love my family and care about my family. I'm not only interested in individual autonomy. And I imagine that Indonesians and Singaporeans and Chinese also care to some extent about what would he or she want. It's not irrelevant to the decision. It's at least one factor that will influence the family decision. So here was the idea about how we could use a large language model. Suppose before you getting in this accident, you train a digital duplicate of yourself on your past medical decisions, on various other sources of writing that reflect your preferences and values. Maybe you even engage in a series of discrete choice experiments where you choose between different options and then the algorithm infers what your preferences and values must be based on the choices you've made. There are various ways you could train a model, various sources of data that you could use, and there's a conversation we could have about those details, but let's just assume you've successfully done this. So now you have a digital duplicate of yourself, a sort of Brian GPT, to use my own example. And now it's the doctors and the family are in the room, but also this little patient avatar is in the room as well, a digital duplicate of the patient. And so it seems like one thing you could do is just ask the digital duplicate of the patient, what would you want to have happen in this situation? And if it's been successfully trained to extract the values and preferences of the patient, it might be that that's an important source of information that should go into the decision-making process. Okay. So we wrote a paper about what we call a personalized patient preference predictor, which we call P4 for short, so that we don't have to keep saying personalized patient preference predictor. And if you're interested in this particular use case, you can look up that paper. Okay, so now let's come back to the idea of life extension. We were thinking, once you've trained a model like this, you could probably use it for various things. You could use it as a patient preference predictor, but you could use it for other things as well. So I'm going to begin by focusing on the case of wanting to leave a legacy that we were talking about before, wanting to finish an important life project. And maybe you get a diagnosis of terminal cancer, and so you know you just are not going to be able to finish this project before you die, before your biological life stops. I want to propose a case where it might be that the use of a personalized large language model could help you fulfill posthumously, so after you die, a goal that you had and that was important to you while you were biologically alive. And the example that I want to use is, suppose you're a writer, you're a novelist, and you've been working for your entire adult life on this epic novel that you have good reason to believe will be an important thing to give to the culture, and that this is a novel you really believe in, and you've been pouring your heart and your soul into this novel for decades, let's say. And let's say you've written about 80% of this novel. And then you get the unfortunate news from the diagnosis that you only have 6 months left to live. So you know you're not going to be able to finish the novel. It's just impossible. Even if you put everything into it, it's not going to happen. So you use your final 6 months to write a very detailed outline of how you intend the final 20% of the novel to go, how you want the plot to resolve, how you want the novel to finish. And then you train a language model on all of your previous writings. So past novels, the first 80% of this novel, so that the model learns your writing style, your approach to character development, the way that you tend to pursue plot lines, and you can put in as a prompt the final 20% in outline form, so that you constrain the model to fulfilling the ends of the novel in alignment with your intentions. So the final thing you do before you die is you leave a note, a set of instructions to your spouse, let's say, or your family members, that says, when I die, it's really important to me that you put the outline into the large language model, and that's been trained on my past writing, so it knows my approach to writing. It writes in my writing style, and I want you to just press go and complete the novel. And whatever it comes up with for the final 20%, I want you to publish in my name. So I can imagine a few responses, and I'm curious about your take, and I'll wrap up soon so that we can have a conversation together. You might think that the best way of fulfilling this legacy goal would be to write the novel yourself. Maybe that's the ideal. But in this case, the ideal isn't possible. So I'm now thinking in terms of what's a second best option. And I'm proposing that using a large language model that intimately represents your approach to writing and character development and plot lines, that's further constrained by a detailed outline reflecting your intentions for how the novel should go, can at least count as a second best way of fulfilling this underlying goal, the sort of goal that people may have when they're pursuing life extension. If only I could live for another 3 years, then I could finish the novel. But you can't live for another 3 years. But you can train a large language model. So what do you think about this case? Suppose you're a novelist. Would you be interested in using a language model to try to finish this particular life project? How many people think it would at least partially count as a fulfillment of this important life goal? Nobody. Nobody appreciates this idea. Maybe you need to think about it more. Maybe it's just not a very compelling example. So you would prefer that the novel just goes unfinished. It stops at 80%, and that's it. Is there anyone in this room who would prefer to complete the novel? This is very interesting data for me. Okay, there's one person. What is your view on using the model to try to finish your life goal? Yeah, that's a very interesting reflection. It occurs to me that there are some historical examples, and I wish I could think of a specific one to share, but I know there are examples of philosophers and novelists who have a very close working relationship with a spouse, usually, a partner, a life partner, who knows them intimately. And they will sometimes entrust the job of finishing, based on their notes, a work of philosophy, for example, to this person who knows them very well. And one option is that they could just maybe, like Hitchens, just say, yeah, I have these notes, I have these ideas, they're unfinished, just publish what I finished. It's very important that I be the one who's responsible for every word on the page. But historically, there are some people who seem to be comfortable with the second best option, which is they trust someone to help them fulfill their vision for an argument or set of ideas or a plot line or whatever it is. And this is because they think that person knows them intimately and can accurately represent their values, their writing style, their preferences, their intentions, and so forth. So one thought I have is that some of the skepticism in this room might be due to a thought that a large language model can't actually accurately represent your preferences, your values, your writing style, and so on. And I'll just say that that was what I thought too before I trained a large language model on my own writing. And I was shocked at how it was able to represent my writing style, my reasoning, my preferences, my values, and so forth. So one hypothesis I'm going to float is that if you ever have a fine-tuned language model that accurately represents you, you might change your minds. You might think that this is a way of fulfilling, at least partially, or as a second best way, one of these important life goals. Okay, the last example, because I've been going on for a while, has to do with relational considerations, like Rona was raising. So there's now an explosion in the use of what some people call grief bots. And a grief bot is a large language model that's fine-tuned on all the writing, so it can be emails or text messages, of somebody who has recently passed away who you love. And there are a range of views about this technology, but let me just describe sort of how it works and what it looks like for a person. So let's say you have someone in your life whom you love dearly, your partner, your spouse, your best friend, and every day you're messaging with them regularly, sharing your ideas and thoughts and jokes and what happened and so forth. And, you know, they acquire an illness, let's say when they're very young, long before they, in some sense, should die, they die. And you have this sudden aching loss of a person who has been central to the way you live in the world and your daily habits and routines and how you make sense of things. And all of a sudden, you send a text message to them and you forget that they can't reply, that they aren't there anymore. Some people, using this new technology, have responded to this situation by training a chatbot on all of the written material of their deceased loved one, and then they'll, in some sense, continue the conversation. So they send a message, and they get a response that's indistinguishable from the response or a type of response that their loved one would have given. Now, some people might find this to be rather grotesque. Look, if someone dies, what you need to do is simply grieve their loss and move on. They're not coming back. You shouldn't be trying to hold on to them so tightly. But I think that type of response might be a little bit too quick, because of course there are many ways we try to hold on to the ones we love in our memories. Through ceremonies, through looking at their old pictures, through reading their writing. Perhaps we read their old text messages to try to recall them to our memory and imagine what it's like to interact with them. We might have a simulated conversation with them just using the resources of our imagination. So I think it's not quite right that when someone that we love dies, we just try to sort of grieve and move on as quickly as possible. There are ways of failing to grieve someone that can prevent us from forming meaningful new relationships with others. So you can imagine becoming perfectly obsessed with this deceased loved one such that you don't engage with the world anymore. And that seems like there's reasons to think that's probably not ideal. But at least some amount of continued engagement with the memory of the person, I think, is consistent with many people's intuitions of what it can look like to healthily grieve the loss of someone. So one potential use of a large language model is, suppose you know you're going to die soon because you have a diagnosis, and you decide with your partner that you're going to create a digital duplicate of yourself that they can continue to talk with after you die. So, again, I'm curious, and I have a suspicion that many of you will think this is a horrible idea. So let's try to understand the reasoning behind your skepticism. So you nodded your head vigorously. Why do you think that you would be not at all interested in being able to continue a conversation with a digital duplicate of a loved one? So let's just think of a loved one in your life. I mean, pick a person that you care about very deeply. Give me their initials. Okay, you're just going to go straight for the answer. All right, what's different? Go ahead. Okay, so it sounds like your skepticism is coming from a doubt about the capacities of the technology. Okay. You might have to take my word for it, because I've spent a lot of time with this technology, but it is currently technologically possible to create a digital duplicate of a person that is very realistic and that very carefully mimics their idiosyncratic style, their speech patterns, the sorts of jokes that they tell, and you can explicitly encode shared memories into these models in various different ways. Either you can feed in all the memories that already exist in the emails you've exchanged with them or the text messages. What are text messages? They're often recording memories, right? Here's what happened today. So that becomes explicitly accessible to the model. It can refer back to that text message. It can say, hey, remember that thing that happened that one day? So this is, again, very useful information for me, that a lot of your skepticism is not necessarily about the idea of a digital duplicate. It's that you just don't think it's possible. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce one concept, and then maybe I'll wrap up so we can have the open questions. How many people have heard of the computer scientist Alan Turing, British computer scientist? Okay. There's something that in philosophy and in computer science we now call a Turing test in honor of Alan Turing, which was his proposed test for when we would decide that a computer was intelligent or had human-level intelligence. And he imagined an experiment where you have two computer screens, let's say, side by side, and then there's a sort of wall separating you from whoever's behind the computer screen. So in one case, it's a person who's just having a conversation with you, let's say by typing. And in the other case, it's just the computer is talking with you using its own technology. And you're supposed to guess, after engaging and testing these different conversation partners, you ask them various things, you push back on claims, you see how they respond. You're supposed to guess which one's the computer and which one's the human. And Turing's idea, I'm giving a simplified version of it, is if it ever gets to the point where you guess at about chance levels, where you're just as likely to be right as wrong, then the computer will have passed the Turing test. It will behave in a manner that's indistinguishable from what a human who is intelligent would behave under those circumstances. And so already it's the case that large language models, just generic ones, can pass the Turing test. And this might be one of the first examples of a computer technology that passes the Turing test. The large language models outstrip human intelligence in certain types of ways. But the idea here is that there would be something called a personalized Turing test. So instead of just a random human and then a computer, it would be, you know, your loved one is behind one computer screen, and a fine-tuned, personalized large language model trained on all of their linguistic output that they've ever produced that's in written form is trained over here. I'm just going to stipulate that a large language model can pass a personalized Turing test, meaning that if you didn't know if it was your loved one or the computer, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference just from typing. So I want you to use your imagination to overcome your skepticism about the capacities of these technologies, and just imagine that the chatbot can pass this personalized Turing test, so that if you didn't know that it was a chatbot, you would think it was your partner. By the way, people are already using chatbots to mimic people for criminal purposes. So you can take a sample of someone's voice and train it on text that you can get from the internet, maybe their YouTube videos, you download the transcripts and you train a model with it, and then you can impersonate them extremely accurately so that actually their family members don't know it's not them. And then you can ask them to give over your bank details, right? So it's very important that we understand the capacities of these technologies, because if we don't believe that technologies can accurately mimic a real person, then we'll be giving our bank details out to criminals. So I stipulate and I insist that these models can accurately imitate individual persons in a highly successful way. So given that that's true, and now you imagine that the person you love the most in the world suddenly passes away, and let's say that they've already trained this model on all of their written material that reflects and encodes their values, their speaking style, and so forth. I wonder how many people here would be tempted to at least try to have a conversation with this model, just one time. Okay, a few hands are coming up. All right, I've lowered the bar it's low enough that you're willing to consider this possibility. So I admit that I would be very curious to try this. Final story here, and then we'll conclude. My best friend in real life passed away about 2 years ago now, and he was a prolific writer. Interestingly, he didn't publish any writings, but he wrote these long emails that would reflect, you know, months of insights and readings he'd done and adventures he's gone on, and his writing very specifically captured his personality. Every time you read an email from Matthew, you really get a sense of him behind the writing. And so just this summer, I went to go visit his widow, and she was in the process of, she'd hired an archivist to go through emails and written diary entries and notes, academic notes and so forth, to create a kind of searchable library of his text as a way of remembering him and honoring his writing, which is a reflection of his mind and a reflection of who he is. And he died very young, when he was just 37 of a form of cancer. And Berta, his widow, asked me just offhandedly what I was working on these days as an academic topic. And I sort of said, oh, well, there's these personalized large language models, and I was kind of giving this example. And it struck both of us in the middle of the conversation that it would be technically very easy to create a realistic duplicate of her deceased husband and my deceased best friend. And this gave us chills because we were very conflicted. So I just want to confess that I myself did not think this is a straightforward good. And one of the tests that we used to decide whether to make one, and we haven't made one, is what would Matthew want? So this is just to bring us back to that substituted judgment standard. We asked, would he consent to having his psychological life represented in the form of a fine-tuned language model? And our provisional conclusion is that he probably wouldn't want to exist in that form. And so we've used that way of thinking as a initial ethical thought for how we might make a decision about whether to create these things, as a minimal criterion, asking, would the person want to be encoded in this form? So I'll leave you with that real story, and thank you for your time, and let's now open up to questions. should pass around? Or just speak loudly, maybe people can
Check. Yeah, thank you, Professor, for your time. I would like to bring a point first. Professor, you bring a good point about that the limits upon AI and this large language model. I think personally it will definitely be beyond how we would perceive today. And I think you are correct on saying that if can mimic someone, I think that is the reality that we are living in right now. You have maybe towards a skeptic, but also some optimistic view on that. But I am interested in how ethically does this AI language model affect on our society? Because I will give my perception on this. When I was seeing on social media and also some friends on how they interact with AI, I can conclude that AI is actually good in the sense of the academic and for the working force, for improving our societal norms or how that we do our work, because it brings efficiency and it also brings more efficiency and better results in that level. But I think it will be ethically very bad for our society. Like, for example, like a lot of young men that have anime waifus, that they would just be lonely, never have a girlfriend, and they would talk to an AI that is like their girlfriend, something like that. And also, I think that ethically it's just quite dangerous when we put AI, that the original purpose is as a tool, right? But when we put it so intrinsically in our interpersonal relationship towards each other, I think it's quite disastrous for society, where like this is we can say it, our loved ones die, and we train our AI language model to perceive them. Then the problem is in just modern society today, and in not even before AI even was born, there's always have a question of existentialism and what is real in the world. And I think when there's something that if humanity doesn't know what is real in the world, then plus add on with AI, plus again, how can we know what is real? When humanity can say we don't know what is real, it's kind of disastrous for humanity in the long term. I want to know your thoughts, Professor. Thank you.
That was a very insightful comment, and I'll share a few thoughts, and I'm curious also what the rest of you feel. So there's a distinction that sometimes people draw between what are called outcome goods versus process goods. And it sounds like you're intuitively identifying a similar type of distinction. It seems like there are some benefits we could bring to society if we're thinking in consequentialist terms. We could improve the efficiency of the reports that we file at work and, I don't know, increase the economy or something like that if we use these tools. And maybe that seems like a good thing if we set aside all other considerations. There's certainly some efficiencies that might be gained, and all else equal, doing something more efficiently might be a good thing. On the other hand, there are what are sometimes called process goods, which have to do with the way that we achieve a certain outcome. And this often has to do with things like whether we've done something with integrity, or whether there's an intrinsic value to how we pursue an end. So let me illustrate this with an extreme example. Let's say that you've always wanted to reach the summit of Mount Everest. On one approach, you get in a helicopter and you just ride it to the top. So there, you're at the summit. The outcome is achieved. On the other hand, suppose you train for months and months and you climb the mountain all the way to the top. The end point is ostensibly the same. You reach the top of the mountain either way, and in one way you even did it much more efficiently. You got there much more quickly and more safely as well. That seems like a good thing. But many people would have the intuition, and I certainly have the intuition, that something would be lost. Something would be lost about getting there in a helicopter rather than through the process of exerting effort and testing your will and so forth. So just as a general response to what you're saying, I think that you're right. We need to be very careful not only to think about consequentialist benefits that AI might bring us. And of course, AI technology companies have a great interest in emphasizing those very considerations. So when you look at any advertising material from any of the big AI companies, whether it's Google or whoever else, always you will find these very strong claims about the benefits that will be brought to society in terms of efficiency. They'll say we'll come up with drug discoveries that will enable us to cure cancers and so forth. And some of these claims, if they turn out to be true, are actually very significant benefits. I mean, suppose it's true that the use of an AI helps us more quickly discover treatments for diseases that cause the death of millions of people. That's not a trivial consideration. And in fact, it might be that even if we sacrifice some process goods in some domains, it might be that the benefits could be sufficiently great that that's a trade-off we're willing to accept. In other domains, you might think that we care much more about the process and that it have a certain type of integrity and that we get to the destination in a certain way. And I think when it comes to our close relationships, for example, that might be one of those areas where if we make it too easy to disengage from reality as we know it, because we have easy access to these imitators or pretenders of relationship partners, then the very process of what it's like to awkwardly get to know another person and have to respond to their real needs and vulnerabilities, which is what we require to have relationships with fellow humans who have needs and vulnerabilities. If we instead relate to an AI girlfriend who can pretend to have needs and pretend to have vulnerabilities, but there's some part of us that knows that, in some sense, she'll always be there for us, and she'll never tire, and she'll always respond in just the way that we hope she will. Now, to some people, maybe that sounds great, but to others, I think, rightly, it has a ring of a very tragic superficiality to it. Because part of what it is to love another human being is precisely to try to be responsive to their needs and vulnerabilities, and to hope that they will respect you in kind. But an AI model can't care about you. It can only pretend to care about you. It can only perform linguistic behavior that looks like what a caring person would say. So I think that we would lose something about the integrity of relationships if it was just too easy to try to replace certain relationships with AI. And I'm actually quite concerned about this and working on a project that's focused specifically on what we should say about AI models coming to fill certain social roles. So the classic case now is you might have an AI assistant, and you use it to help fill out a form at work or something like that for your increased efficiency. But as you rightly pointed out, these AI chatbots are increasingly being used and even designed to fulfill a range of more specific social roles that have historically only been filled by fellow human beings, like an AI companion that's sort of like a friend, or an AI girlfriend, or an AI mentor or teacher or coach. So those are being produced by the AI companies as well. And with fellow humans, we have a sense of intuitively what counts as a good relationship, what counts as a relationship that has integrity, because we've practiced these cooperative norms for different types of relationships for millions of years and shaped through our local cultures, to go back to the global-local distinction. When we have an AI that mimics human behavior, I can imagine this is going to create a psychological problem for us, because on the one hand, it's going to try to exploit our relational psychology to get us to keep using it, to seem familiar. So it will perform things like sadness, and then I'm going to feel maybe compelled to try to comfort the AI. But on the other hand, part of me will know that, or likely believe, that it doesn't have subjective states. It doesn't feel sadness. So that might make me feel sort of taken advantage of in a certain sort of way. Well, wait, why is it inducing me to try to respond with caring behavior, even though, unlike a human, it doesn't have needs? You know, in humans, we're talking about the philosophy of emotions. Emotions serve certain functions. Often what emotions do is they signal mental states that encode needs that we're trying to communicate implicitly and automatically to a partner. So sadness communicates that you need some sort of care. Anger communicates that you feel you've been wronged and that there's a need to repair the relationship. So our emotions, when they're sincerely felt and communicated, communicate about our needs. If an AI pretends to have emotions and pretends to have needs, even though it's inexhaustible and it never tires, unlike a real human, I do think that this is going to have very serious and potentially negative ramifications for our relationships. And just one final thought on this, because it's such a rich question that you've asked. You know, there are some people who have struggled their whole lives to form successful romantic relationships. And I'll use the example of men. In Japan, there's an overrepresentation of men who have no romantic partners and can't envision that they could ever acquire one. So you might think, well, that's just too bad. Some people in life, they just aren't able to find a friend or a mate, and they are destined to be very lonely, and to spend their days going home to their apartment. Maybe they're socially rejected or whatever. I'm imagining that for some such individuals, and there are, of course, women this way, and people of all genders who may feel this way, that being able to have a pseudo-relationship with an artificial intelligence could at least fulfill some of the needs that they have to feel companionship. You know, some people get pets, non-human animals, to help them fulfill some of their emotional needs. And so for some people who are really on the edges of society, who maybe don't have a human option for a relational partner, it's possible that it could be a benefit, almost like a therapeutic device for some such people that you might want to make available under those circumstances. The cases that I'm really worried about are people who, if only they put in the effort, they could form a meaningful human relationship with others, who then become incentivized not to put in the effort because they have this tempting alternative that always seems to cater to their needs and never seems to say no. So that segment of society I'm really quite worried about when it comes to the easy availability of AI that could, in some sense, try to represent certain relational roles. So thanks for your question, and those are my thoughts in response. Other questions or thoughts people wanted to raise? Yes.
Okay, thank you, sir. I wanna ask you about the digital duplicate. If it's really possible, are people gonna have it like one per individual, or it is just for some people that is important, or for the society, or maybe have some impact for the society? Because from the example that you give to us, it is always the novelists or writers that have the digital duplicate. So, yeah. So I wanna know that what if that person doesn't have any particular or important goals for the society? Are they gonna have the duplicate? The digital duplicate or not? Thank you.
It's a good question, and I'll try to actually tie it back to another aspect of the previous question I forgot to mention, which is this question of reality versus inauthenticity or misrepresentation or confusion about what's real. So many people produce a lot of linguistic evidence that isn't necessarily in the form of a novel, insofar as they use text messages to communicate with their friends. So it isn't on each person to necessarily produce a significant benefit to all of society in the way that perhaps a great artist might. You know, everyone should aspire to contribute to society to the best of their ability. But let's suppose someone simply has tried their best and they haven't managed to produce something that has a significant social impact. Well, we still are embedded in networks of relationships that have meaning and value to us in our local level, even if we aren't having a global impact on the world. And I think these local community-based relationships between friends and family and parents and children and extended family and local business people, living out a life where you try to live those relationships with integrity, I think can be a meaningful life. And the little things that you produce that have meaning within that network of a community are meaningful for you. So the technology is such that really anyone will be able to create one. And so it certainly is likely to happen that people who are not artists and people who are not novelists will be able to, and probably many people will, create these fine-tuned models that try to duplicate them by training them on their text messages or their emails, for example. And I'm not sure what I think about that. I do want to come back to the question of what's real, so let me come back to that again. So I think many of us tend to think of the analog world as real and the digital world as somehow unreal or less real. And there's certainly ways in which people can impersonate someone without telling you that that's what they're doing, and then that's a sort of a form of deception. So if you have an AI that's mimicking someone for purposes of stealing your credit card information, there's a very straightforward sense in which you are failing to perceive reality. You mistakenly believe that the person on the phone line is your son, when actually it's an AI that's duplicating your son's voice to ask you for a bank transfer. So I think that that's a very serious ethical concern, and I think that, and it's partly why I suggest we have to be ready for the idea that there will be convincing digital duplicates, because they will be used by bad actors, and they are currently being used by bad actors. So the technology exists, and it's happening. But there's another question about what do we mean when we say something is real or not. So let's imagine that you're having a video conversation with a friend who lives in another country. So what you're interacting with really is just, a two-dimensional video screen with pixels, and you have an audio feed that's sort of encoding their voice in sound waves and being processed digitally. And, they're responding in real time, but you're not actually interacting with them in some analog form. You're looking at pixels moving around on a screen that are caused by things that they are doing. So you're not interacting with them, you're interacting with downstream consequences of actions that they're taking far, far away. But you might think that you're still having a real conversation with the person. So even though it's mediated through this digital form, certain aspects of what's going on are real. And the fact that they're mediated through a digital form doesn't make them less real, unless there's a very idiosyncratic notion of what we mean by real. Now take another example. Let's say you just have old video clips of that conversation, and now let's say the friend is no longer alive. And you miss them, so you go and you watch these video recordings of old conversations you had with them. Is there a sense in which it's unreal, what you're experiencing? Now it's true that there's no longer a seat of consciousness that's producing new behavior that's being encoded in a digital form and then affecting you on the other side. But I don't think that makes it less real. What you have is a recording of previous behavior that the person took that is meaningful, that has intent, that is related to a desire to communicate with you. But the key thing is it's important that you know it's a video recording. So here's where the real, unreal thing comes in an ethically relevant sense, in my opinion. If you didn't know it was a video recording, and you thought you were talking to your friend live, then you would be making a straightforward mistake. You would be mistaken about what was going on. So I don't think a video recording is less real than talking to someone in person. We just have to know what aspect of reality we're engaging with. We're engaging with a digitally encoded representation of the behavior of this person in the past. So I think that one ethical lesson for the development of digital duplicates is that it's crucial that we be aware, if we want to be in touch with reality, that it's a digital duplicate, and that it isn't the person. And so this might affect ethical decisions about how these things are designed. It might be that the AI companies have to require that the model regularly remind you that it isn't conscious, regularly remind you that the person on whose data it is trained no longer exists, for example. And then the question is, if you engage with the model, are you engaging in an unreal interaction? I don't think so, as long as you know what you're doing. You know, and there's lots of ways, this is what's striking. So there's lots of ways that we live on after we die in various forms. We speak metaphorically about living on in our writings, in people's memories. The thing about a digital duplicate is that it creates new behavior that's based on information about the person. And that's the thing that we can't do without this technology. So I might live on in your memory, and your memory might change over time. I might live on in my writings, and you can go back to them, and maybe how people relate to them and the meanings they attribute to my writings might change over time. But if my writings then start to write new writings, that has never existed before in any form that I can think of. And so I think it's very puzzling philosophically what we should think about this and the extent to which we should think of it as a genuine reflection of the person, but in some new, sophisticated, digitally mediated form. I'm simply not sure. But I think these are exactly the questions that we have to ask and for which hopefully philosophy can make some contributions. Okay, other questions? Yes, back here in the white shirt.
Oh, okay. Speaking about the realness of digital duplicate, I'm wondering about the ontological status of digital duplicate is quite important, because if we talk about maybe the human right and the subject of law of the digital duplicate, what do you think about that? If I have a digital duplicate and someone tried to do some kind of violence to my digital duplicate, would it be protected by the law, or is it granted by maybe human right or etc.? Thank you.
So I'm so pleased and impressed with the questions that you all are asking, because the questions you're asking are precisely the ones that at the very cutting edge of this field, philosophers are beginning to try to understand. So the legal status of a digital duplicate is very uncertain at this point. And in fact, although I follow this literature closely, I've only seen 1 or 2 papers where people have tried to systematically begin to answer that question. I'm not an expert in law, so let's try to think of the related ethical questions that hopefully the law in some way reflects or encodes. There is a prior literature on whether a person can be wronged when someone mistreats an avatar that they're using in a computer game. So computer game avatars have been around for a long time. So we have a little bit more literature on this phenomenon. So imagine you're playing a multiplayer game live with people connected through the internet, and you have a little action figure that represents you and that you're controlling with the controller. And maybe it's blue and has hair that's different from you. I mean, it doesn't necessarily look like you, but there's some sense in which it's your representative in this virtual world. And there are some cases where, and often there's a gendered angle to this, where a female player will undergo something that in the virtual world looks like an assault and violates the rules of the game or what the community norms are around how the other players should be treated. Now, on the one hand, you could say, Well, it isn't that she was assaulted, because there's just pixels moving around on the screen. But on the other hand, many people have the intuition, and I share it, that there's some sense in which she is being wronged through the symbolic mistreatment of an avatar that represents her in that world. So I think a similar thing could be possible in the case of these digital duplicates. That, well, there's two ways of thinking about this. So we're talking about deontology, so I'm thinking of Kant and Kant's analysis of how we should treat animals and non-human animals. And Kant had the idea that animals did not themselves have intrinsic moral status such that we owed duties to them to treat them a certain way, because Kant had a very particular view about what grounds moral status, including rationality and responsiveness to reasons. Nevertheless, he thought it was wrong to torture an animal and to mistreat it. But why was it wrong? The animal wasn't being wronged, on Kant's view, but rather, by mistreating the animal, we were in some way corrupting our own character, or maybe practicing behaviors that are vicious and that would cause us to mistreat our fellow human beings, who Kant thought were the ultimate beings that are owed respect intrinsically and ought to be treated as means in and of themselves. So I could imagine an analysis about digital duplicates that's a little bit like this. Somebody might say, look, there's nothing it's like to be a digital duplicate. The digital duplicate doesn't experience pleasures or pains on most leading theories. And so if you behave in a nasty manner towards somebody's digital duplicate by insulting it, by failing to respond compassionately when it performs sadness, you might think that you're not wronging the digital duplicate because it's not the sort of entity that can be wronged. But you might nevertheless think that you are behaving wrongly, that you ought not to treat the digital duplicate that way because, in some sense, you're licensing yourself to engage with entities that are human-like in various respects in a way that we ought not to practice. You could take maybe a virtue ethics, sort of Aristotelian approach to this. You know, we're habituating ourselves poorly when we allow ourselves to mistreat a digital duplicate of another person. And then finally, I think there might be a sense in which you're indirectly wronging the human that's represented by the digital duplicate in something like the example of the video game. So if I know that this digital duplicate substantially encodes psychological features of a person that are distinctive of them, that's the whole point about these digital duplicates, is they're not just generic large language models. They're fine-tuned on sometimes very intimate details of a person's life and aspects of their psychology that maybe they've only shared with certain people before. If I know that this digital duplicate in some sense represents a human, by behaving in an untoward manner toward the digital duplicate, I can imagine some sort of analysis according to which I'm indirectly wronging the human who is represented by the digital duplicate. But that's as far as I thought about it. I mean, as you can tell, these are very preliminary thoughts because we've never had real digital duplicates before. They've only ever existed in this form in the last year or so. Yes, over here in the black shirt.
Okay, thank you, Professor. It's actually related to the previous question. I was thinking about this example, like maybe we can make a digital duplicate of Nikola Tesla, and we can add to this digital duplicate the books that he has read, everything that he has made. Then, accidentally, then not accidentally, then we put like new knowledge into that digital duplicate. Then we ask this digital duplicate to make new invention of Nikola Tesla. But Nikola Tesla, for example, he against capitalism. Like he doesn't want his publication to be like profit for governments or economical lives. So if the invention or maybe like the owner of this digital duplicate choose to erase the moral or the philosophical view of Nikola Tesla, will it be a harm for like Nikola Tesla himself, or the digital duplicate? And I want to ask a little bit of life extension, because I think life extension is really related into biological kind of field like bioethics. Then maybe, and bioethics, I think it's really related to a big change of big data of health. So for example, we have this digital duplicate of ourselves and our biological things as well. Then in this biological field, we can see the forecasting of our health. Then this data maybe can be shared to the governments and can be shared to the corporate, and then they make it to analysis for the like insurance or turnover or the like pension, and this can make a new gap into the society. What do you think about it? Thank you.
Well, the pattern of very excellent questions continues with your very insightful set of observations. So I guess I'll start with the Nikola Tesla example and then come to the notion of biological digital twins, which also is a more long-standing literature, because you're right, in healthcare, there's long been an attempt to try in the area of personalized medicine to come up with computer models of specific bodily processes that I have based on data that I generate that can then be used for predictive purposes and so forth, and can also be misused, as you rightly point out. The Nikola Tesla example is very interesting because in a paper my colleagues and I published just last month, we raised the example of historical figures being trained into a model that would capture their knowledge and their writing style and so forth. And on the one hand, there's a question of what are the different ways we might use this reanimated historical figure. I mean, imagine Socrates, in some sense, coming back to life, purely metaphorically. You can imagine certain wonderful things that could come from this. I mean, you could imagine when you're teaching school children about great thinkers of the past, that rather than reading a boring, dry, old textbook, they could actually engage with Socrates, who could actually engage in a Socratic dialogue with them. I mean, imagine engaging with a Socratic dialogue with Socrates, rather than just learning about and reading about the dialogues Socrates had in the past. I can imagine that would be extremely inspiring and interesting to many students. I would find it very interesting to get to do that. And it's quite interesting to think what happens when you pose questions to Socrates that the historical Socrates has no written record of ever having entertained. To me, that is quite an interesting phenomenon. So you can imagine a version of this where the duplicate of Socrates sort of elucidates various points that were raised in the texts that we have available, you know, from later students who tell us about Socrates. But now you ask Socrates, what do you think about the ethics of digital duplicates, for example? Or what do you think about some topic that Socrates never encountered? It's very interesting to me, what is the status then of the response? You know, is there a sense in which it's a reflection of what Socrates might say about this case? I mean, we do engage in this type of reasoning in philosophy all the time. So for example, we give Kantian analyses of new technologies. And in a way, what we're doing is we're imagining what Kant would say about a certain type of new technology that Kant never thought about, never encountered. And this seems to be perfectly legitimate when we do this in the form of just using our philosophical imaginations. So I think it comes back to the question of reality again. As long as we know how a large language model works, which is very important, and we've published an article suggesting that education about how AI works should be mandatory starting in elementary school in an age-appropriate way, so that from the very first ages now, we'll know how to be critical toward the use of AI. We don't think of it as some sort of godlike invention that we just automatically defer to because we're in awe of it. We need to be skeptical in the way that many of you have expressed skepticism. So as long as we know how it works and we understand that what's being generated, in some sense, reflects the type of reasoning that Socrates engaged in, but isn't some new proclamation from Socrates, then I think if we treat it like that, it's like what we do when we give a Kantian analysis of a new technology. And to my mind, that seems okay, and it seems generative and very interesting. The Tesla example that you raised is fascinating because in this case you were talking about using a duplicate of Tesla to engage in activities that Tesla himself would have condemned. And there is a literature in philosophy about whether a person can be wronged after they die or harmed after they die, and it's debated. Some people say, when you're dead, you're dead. You have no further interests. So whatever happens, happens. But many societies have something like the view that the dead can be wronged, and that there are certain ways of showing respect to the dead. And it's unclear what the metaphysics are of this, whether they think the dead person still exists as a soul or something like that. That's maybe one view. Another thing is that people think someone really does exist in our memories. I mean, literally, we exist in each other's memories. Maybe I'll just elaborate this point because I think it's quite interesting. So all of you here are forming a memory of me based on my behavior, and you have no access to my internal life. I mean, you can't get inside my head. You don't know what my consciousness is, or even whether I'm conscious. I might be what's called a philosophical zombie, which is an entity that looks exactly like a human, is indistinguishable from a human, but there's nothing it's like inside. So there's a big debate about that. So the sense in which I exist for all of you is only in the sense of your interpretation of my behavior. I can never exist in any other form because you can't get outside of that. You can't get inside my head. So I have a perspective on myself, and I have a first-person perspective, and I have my own memories, and many of these memories you don't know, so you have a partial model of me. But the only sense in which I exist for all of you is as a little avatar that you're creating in your head of me. It's very incomplete. It's based on impressions and inferences. But if we know someone very well, if we have a close intimate who's spent their lives with us, with whom we've shared intimate details and so forth, their little avatar of us is pretty rich and robust. It may still not be the same as my own self-conception, but the point I want to make is that no one has my self-conception except for me. What they might have is my best attempt to share my self-conception through conversation. They might have their interpretations of my behavior. So in what I take to be a pretty fundamental metaphysical sense, we only ever exist in other people's memories. So when we die, we continue to exist, in my mind, in precisely the same form we only ever existed, which is in people's memories. The only difference that I see is that my seat of consciousness is no longer providing new behavior to update the model in your head. So my way of thinking about it is that if a person only ever exists outside of their own mind, in the minds and memories of others, and they continue to exist in precisely that way, and a person can be wronged, for example, by gossiping about them in a way that they never hear about. Suppose I tell a scurrilous lie about you to many people and harm your reputation, but you never find out about this. Now, if you have a purely hedonistic view of welfare and you might think that all that matters is your experience of pleasure and pain, you might say, well, at the end of the day, I don't know about it, so no harm, no foul. But I think many people would feel that I've really wronged you by lying about you and damaging your reputation, even if you don't ever find out about it. Many people would feel that way. So the Nikola Tesla case is really fascinating. I can imagine some people saying that if you've died long enough in the past, and if you are, in some sense, a public figure, then maybe you're sort of become, there's like a fair use clause or something like that, where your engagement with the public sphere means that you don't really get to have control over how people respect your legacy or not. Whereas for maybe a private citizen, we might think that, look, they didn't put themselves in the public light, and maybe we owe them a different kind of respect to their memory. But I can imagine you're a Nikola Tesla scholar or something, and you have a great reverence for Nikola Tesla, and you know about the details of Nikola Tesla, including the kinds of values that he had while he lived, and you just know for sure that Nikola Tesla would absolutely hate a digital duplicate of himself being used to create some commercial product. I'd have to work out the philosophical details, and maybe you'll have to work out the philosophical details, but I certainly share the intuition that there's something unseemly about doing that, even though Nikola Tesla isn't alive anymore and isn't going to be subjectively harmed in terms of his conscious states or something like that. I think there's a sense in which it would be disrespectful to Tesla's legacy, so to speak. And I would think it would probably be wrong to use a digital duplicate of Tesla in a way that we have good reason to think he would reject. That's my initial impression, but I'd have to work on it some more. Okay, time is up. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions.